Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of Kitchen Pedagogy. I want to talk about a blog post that I've written around different ways students find learning hard. And this is a really kind of forensic thing, really, where even when teachers are very effective and very engaging and students are generally learning, there's still often students in any given class who are finding it harder than others. And I'm fascinated by the reasons why, that some students are kind of not there with you, not following. And by highlighting them, making teachers be more conscious of the possibility that that's going on, I think is really helpful. The first thing is just the sense of feeling adrift. It's interesting how some students can sort of mentally feel outside of the lesson, and you can sit with them and you can sort of experience why, because the teacher doesn't necessarily come to them, talk to them. And if that happens for an extended period, the student can sometimes think that the lesson's going on around them, and then the ideas that are being shared, and they can hear it all going on, but it's not coming to them. And so they start observing rather than thinking. And that cuts them adrift. If a teacher is very systematically cold calling, making sure everyone's with them, and doing a lot of pair work, checking for understanding, and always sort of talking about who's not sure and finding that out, it's more likely that the students are going to be sort of in there listening. But if it's all a bit of a kind of geek out with a few very enthusiastic students and there's lots of excitement over in that corner, you can sometimes feel like it's not connecting to you. And be aware of that. Sometimes it's literally in the corners of the room, the back row, that the students just create this sort of bubble where they're not in the lesson with everybody else. And the teacher just needs to go right into that group and to say, come on guys, what are you thinking? And bring them in and be spotting it. And it can happen sporadically throughout a lesson. So that thing of scanning and thinking, who's not with me? Let's bring them back in, but with a question and with an invitation to participate. Sometimes students don't have the prior knowledge that you need them to have. And that's obviously a very fundamental thing to do with formative assessment and planning the curriculum. If the ideas are going over their head, again, they don't know what's being discussed. And if you make too many assumptions about what they should already know and the students just don't, that can just obviously mean they just sort of completely unable to participate. And that can be sort of quite unfair in a way. But of course you need to get through the curriculum. But having a really good idea of the basic knowledge, you really need to have these conceptual ideas secure before this new thing is going to make sense. And then checking the students have got that is going to be important. If you just assume they know things or have done things or have been to places or then they haven't, then that's not going to be helpful to them. So that real sense of, right, this is what you should already know, let's make sure, let's check, and conspicuously building on prior knowledge as part of the learning process is really, really important. Sometimes these ideas are too abstract. So the third thing is they don't have a concrete home for the idea. And that could be something as simple as, or as complicated as fractions, say. Fractions become very abstract. They become numbers with a line and symbolic very quickly sometimes. And the students who don't have a concrete home for thinking about the scale of numbers and fractions within a number find that the problems around the manipulation of fractions incredibly difficult because they don't really know what they're dealing with. Or it could be an abstract thing to do with a form of language where you just need to give an example of it and it will make sense. Or a chemistry experiment where we're suddenly talking about the symbolic representation of it, but the students can't give you an example of one that they've seen, and it doesn't make sense to them because they can't visualize what's going on. It could be something to do with describing something like the diffusion of a gas, and students have got this general definition of that, but they can't describe a scenario very well. So having a scenario where diffusion is happening, which is their go-to scenario, like perfume bottles, the smell spreading out, that could be a really good concrete example of the process of diffusion, which they kind of hold on to help them explain that phenomenon. Sometimes they don't have the language. You need to teach often the grammar around some terms. So for example, if I'm teaching you about erosion, I also need you to teach you how to say the rocks are eroded by the water, or the water erodes the rocks. I need to model the forms of erosion, erodes, eroded by, and get you saying those words explicitly so that you're comfortable with them. And if you assume that the students will just work out those grammatical forms, often they don't, and therefore they avoid using them. It could be terminology, just the confidence, the deliberate vocabulary development that you need to say something like esophagus or carbon dioxide even. If students don't have the confidence to say the words because they're familiar with them and they use them all the time, they tend to avoid them, and they have a much poorer kind of grasp of what's going on because they simply haven't had that practice. So give them the language, make language development a really important feature of all new terms where all the students are practicing. Quite a common thing is the steps are too big. I mean, if you've ever had this experience yourself, and say, so learning a dance routine, or folding, something with origami. Someone shows you, then you do this, then you do this, then you do this, then you do this, and you think, well, hang on a minute, you've got way too far. I don't know I can't even do the first bit yet. I've had that experience. You probably have. The students have it all the time. So you need to. Instructional teaching needs to be far more sort of step by step. Let's try this. Have you got that right? Right? Can you do this bit? Right, can you do them together? Can you do 3 steps? So here's the 4th one. Let's see if we can do 1, 2, 3, 4, and build in smaller steps. And that could be to do with maths or writing or ideas in science or some art techniques. Step by step by step. If you show them too many at once, or the conceptual leap is too big, students will fall behind. This is an interesting one, watching but not learning. Now, modelling is actually quite difficult. I could show you how to produce some extended maths procedures for a particular type of maths problem, or some writing. I could show you how I would write a whole paragraph. I could show you how to produce something in DT and how to make a box, or how to use a certain tool. But then, can you then do it yourself? Well, often the students can't. They were watching and they were seeing you do it, but they weren't really able to engage with it because it was, again, probably too many steps. And by the time they then get to do it themselves, they weren't really thinking about what they were going to do while they were watching you. So watching someone produce a beautiful piece of writing doesn't in itself teach you how to do it if you're not really consciously thinking about each of the stages and then processing them. So again, often it comes down to the steps being too big and the handover from the modeler to the student being not successful. It's like dropping the baton in a relay race. So it's like you were trying to, but it doesn't happen for all of the students. So often the solution is to do it more step by step. Like, can you do this first bit? Right, let's see if you can. Right, can you now do the second bit? Let's see if everyone's done it and check. And then, okay, some students seem to be more ready so they can go off, and maybe they don't need to be modelled for the rest of it. But some do need to be sort of shown all the way, step by step, and then you gradually fade back so they're doing more of it by themselves. Another example is to do with not being made to think. So if I was to say to you, can you remember what you did yesterday? And I say that out loud in the class, somebody will pipe up and they say, oh yeah, well, you're doing that stuff to do with Vietnam, or whatever the topic was. And so the student over here wasn't made to think about that because someone else piped in and they were just sort of just gearing up possibly. But their thought process was curtailed because someone else produced the answer. Or, they just could opt out. They think, well, I don't have to. The way that these lessons typically go is someone else will say it. So I don't need to think, so I kind of generally wait. Someone might say, who can do question 3, and where they're looking at the board. But if the normal pattern is someone else normally provides an answer, you just think, well, I'll wait for that. If you want everyone to think, you need to make them all think. So you give the questions, you say, right, everybody have a go at this question. And then you go around supervising and checking that students aren't doing it. Or you just say, I want everyone to come up with 3 features of yesterday's lesson that you can remember, and then I'm going to cold call to see which ones are. So the students know they could be called on, so they have to think. So try to construct your tasks or questions so that the students have to think, and they don't have an option not to, because students who have the option not to often don't. It's not because they're lazy, it's just because it becomes a habit. It becomes a habit that other people typically do the thinking. Sometimes students need more time to think. I mean, I've literally seen teachers do lessons where the students have had 10 seconds. They said, okay, guys, think about this. I'll give you 10 seconds. And the student is there going, what was it? And then the student says, right, okay, so what's the answer? And the student next to me is thinking, well, hang on a minute, I've barely got my brain into gear. You haven't given me time. That happens a lot. And then again, it becomes a habit. If you sort of think, well, when the teacher says 10 seconds, they don't really want me to give an answer. So they check out again. If you mean it, give them the time and then cold call so that anyone could be asked to respond. Then the habit becomes, oh, it's a question I need to think about. I'll definitely need to think about it because I might be asked, and then they engage more. Sometimes the learning isn't generative enough, and that's a really important thing. If I can do a task just by using the resources around me without having to use my own prior knowledge, then I don't have to engage it, and then again, I don't learn that much. So for example, if I can label a diagram in my book by copying it off the board or using the textbook, and it's all very obvious, there's the labels, there I do it, or I can find the answer to that question just by looking it up. Oh, simple comprehension, there it is, bosh, put it in, organise it into a table, it all looks nice. Do I know any of that stuff? Can I explain any of that stuff? Or maybe not, because it wasn't asked to. And it's surprising how many tasks students are asked to do in lessons which are not generative, where they don't need to think very much at all about what they already know. They just use the stuff which is external to them to complete the task, and then they end up with almost no change to what they know. Make them think, make them having to produce something. The end point is book shut, right, now explain it. That's the end point. So while they're doing the task, they're thinking, right, I've got to get to the point where I can explain this. So that makes them think even more deeply all the way along. The next one is about the culture of error. Sometimes students become confused in a lesson, but they don't want to say anything because they're afraid to, because the culture in the class is that's awkward, that's not accepted, that's not welcomed, it makes me feel stupid. And that is a culture teachers create, not on purpose, but it does happen. Are the kids in your class too afraid to ask? Well, why might that be? But if you create a culture where we're always talking about the mistakes we've made, who got number 3 wrong? Really, what did you put? Okay, so why did you think of that? And that just becomes a habit. On a test, we got 8 out of 10. What 2 did you get wrong? That's 8's great. What 2 did you get wrong? Why do you think you couldn't do them? Well, let's have a look at what you did say. Talking about, and owning up to this constantly. When we get things wrong, let's explore it. If we do that day in, day out, the students soon learn the habit that talking about my confusion is normal, and they're not afraid to ask, and that's a much healthier position. Sometimes students need more time to consolidate. I've got a tenuous grasp of this. I used to find this all the time with learning languages. Like I felt like every time we go into a lesson, there's more stuff, and I'm barely confident on the stuff we've already just been taught. And so you feel like the whole thing is running away from you because there's just more and more and more and more that you're not very good at. That's what a lot of students experience. You just need time to just practice stuff. No more stuff, just practice. Practice explaining it, using it, applying it, just repeating it. And it could be all sorts of things, using words, math skills, art skills. If we layer and layer and layer on shaky foundations, the students end up massively underconfident and unable to perform very well. Give them time to consolidate, make that a priority. And it's a great lesson sometimes when you just feel like all we're doing is doing practice. So more time to practice, more time to consolidate. These are the last sorts of things. So there's a lot in there, but just think about it. Think about the students in your class who are struggling. Think about why they might be struggling, and think about the ways you can get them to feel more confident, more secure, more engaged, more with it, more thinking more. And if you do that in your habits, then you're changing their habits, and things will be better for them and better for you.